It's March 11th, 1989, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Video vérité, its co-creator John Langley called it. The New York Times said it was simply tabloid TV. Rupert Murdoch, as ever, was just proved right when everybody watched it. The show was Cops, a gritty reality show following the police, which aired on this day in 1989 and became one of the longest-running TV shows in history.
And Langley came up with the idea for the show when he was working on the 1983 documentary Cocaine Blues, that it would be cool to have a sort of no-frills, fly-on-the-wall show. And then he had entitled it Street Beat, but he pitched it around to the networks and no one was interested, until the writers' strike struck, if that's what happens, with strikes. And suddenly this show with no actors and no host and no script and no writers sounded like a pretty good idea.
Yeah, and looking back from a perspective where we're so inundated with every type of police show, because they are so cheap to make, at the time it could have been seen as a gamble precisely because there hadn't been a programme like Cops before. Cocaine Blues was a one-off documentary, and there had been others as well in 1977 called The Police Tapes that followed officers in the South Bronx, or the infamous Police in 1982, which was a documentary about Thames Valley Police, which attracted a lot of notoriety for the very unsympathetic way in which a rape victim was treated and actually led to some reforms within the system. But you had never had a whole show like Cops that was every single week showing you the inside of what police work was.
And partly the reason for that wasn't just that it hadn't been commissioned, but also that the police hadn't cooperated to allow that to happen. It's one thing, isn't it, to allow you to film with them for one day or one evening or on one particular raid. It's quite another to say to a police force for an entire county, we're going to film you warts and all, and we want to be with you 24/7. That's a very different thing. And the reason that Broward County, Florida, was the police force featured in the pilot episode of Cops that aired on this day was because another documentary, American Vice, The Doping of a Nation, also produced by John Langley, had been filmed with the corporation of that county's police department in 1986. And so Langley worked up that relationship for 3 years.
Do you think that at this stage in police history, just every officer was being followed by 2 to 3 cameras?
It went from, in 1989, police forces being reluctant to cooperate with the show to just 2 years later, you had forces queuing up to be featured. For instance, in the aftermath of the Rodney King beating in 1991, LAPD, who previously had wanted nothing to do with Cops, was suddenly very eager to get on the show. And that touches on what a lot of the critics of Cops have been bringing up for decades at this point, which is the interaction between the media and the police. You know, in a cooperation like this is by its nature very chummy, because the police can withdraw their cooperation at any time, and, you know, the camera crew knows that, the producers know that, and they're filming up to, I think it was up to 400 hours of footage per episode. So what you're seeing, a 22-minute episode, is inherently going to be extremely selective footage.
Yeah. I mean, also, wildly and entirely contrary to popular belief, the people being arrested doesn't absolve them of their rights not to be filmed and to be broadcast. So actually all of the producers have to constantly be getting releases signed by the arrestees and the suspects. And people just say, yeah, I'm happy to be on the show. I guess because for some people, they're like, that's cool, I can be on telly. I don't know what it is. I can't actually speculate on why so many people would possibly say yes to being filmed in that compromising situation.
Well, I might be able to help you with that, Arion. The answer may be contained in an investigative podcast series broadcast in 2019 called Running from Cops.
Ah, thank God for podcasts.
Which spoke to some former alleged perps, and they found accusations of all kinds of questionable practices. I'm just repeating them so this isn't slander, but some former alleged perpetrators claim that they were drunk or high when they signed the releases.
They're on camera, clearly slurring their words and crashing cars. I don't think that's a wild claim, is it?
Some said they didn't sign the form at all, and some said they felt coerced because the distinction was not made clear as to what they were signing and who were the producers and who were the police officers.
Who's asking? Exactly.
Yeah.
If the guy with a camcorder who's with the police force and is presumably walking around in certain dodgy areas of Florida wearing bulletproof vests and stuff, you're just kind of assuming if they're with the police, I better do what they're saying. They're arresting me. They're asking me to sign this thing.
Yeah, I mean, unquestionably, this is pretty exploitative television, not least because one of its features is that Langley had the idea that each show should be constrained within this 3-act structure. So it starts with the kind of car or foot chase, and then you subdue this uncooperative suspect, and then you have a sort of more slow things down middle sequence with a kind of rational conversation going on. And then the final bit is sort of moral message with a cop lecturing someone to, stay off drugs or whatever it is. To make reality fit that structure, necessarily there's going to be a whole lot of editorializing going on.
Well, yes, but the first episode is remarkably, I think, unmanipulated compared to where we are now with reality TV. And I'm using broad brush phrase there to mean everything from Big Brother through to the Kardashians. We are now used to the idea that there will be crash zooms, there will be specially composed soundtracks that go with each beat of the drama. Yeah, actually, you watch the first episode of Cops, and yes, of course, they've selected the dramatic stuff. But it seems funny now to think that it was seen by high-minded critics as tabloid TV, as Murdoch bringing his shtick to the States, when actually it looks almost art house now. It looks completely unfiltered. And it's also worth, I think, considering the role of Fox in commissioning this, which happened, yes, partly because it was cheap and partly because of the writers' strike, as we've said, but also partly because they were Fox. And their whole point was to try and do something left field and different to the other networks. And it's worth just remembering, as we discussed in our episode Meet the Simpsons, this is the same year. This is 1989. This is just a few months before they launched The Simpsons, this other gigantic influential hit. They are creating 2 massively long-running shows there, Cops and The Simpsons, by basically picking up stuff that other networks wouldn't do, that essentially stripped away the production values other people were interested in.
Yeah, and I think it's massive success. As far back as 2005, Broadcasting and Cable estimated that Cops had generated $500 million over its 17 seasons at the time, through kind of syndication and licensing and DVD sales and everything. It wasn't just the raw broadcast. But I think that goes as well to the reason why the critics couldn't ignore it. It was such big business.
Yeah, and it actually got 4 Emmy nominations in its first 5 years on the air, which shows that for all the criticism it did receive, there was also a kind of critical appreciation of what the show was doing, which, now the brand seems so tarnished for reasons we'll obviously get into, but it certainly was being seen as at least middlebrow, if not highbrow.
Well, it was influenced by Hill Street Blues, Rebecca, the third reference to Hill Street Blues in 2022.
There were so many opportunities where I could have chimed in, and I held back.
But it was the handheld style in Hill Street Blues that led to an appetite. People had seen it in drama. They wanted to see the real thing. Yeah,
and it ended in tragedy in one instance in 2014 when an audio technician on the show was killed by a stray bullet from an officer during a shootout at a Wendy's restaurant in Omaha, Nebraska. And ironically, Omaha was one of those police forces which had agreed to collaborate with cops specifically to repair their image after an incident of police brutality which had happened recently before that. It's not even the first instance whereby members of the crew have intervened. They've had instances where crew members have chased down suspects, where they've wrestled them off of officers who are being overwhelmed. So there have been those instances where that fourth wall is blurred.
Okay, so let's talk about those criticisms that you mentioned. I mean, the main one basically is around race, isn't it? There's a civil rights group called Colour of Change, which mounted a campaign to cancel Cops before it was initially cancelled by Fox and then put on another network, on the basis that the producers had built, quote, a model around distorted and dehumanising portrayals of black Americans and the criminal justice system, and had created a reality where the police are always competent, crime-solving heroes, and where the bad boys always get caught.
And I think there was a massive overrepresentation of the number of black people being arrested versus white people. But it also hugely distorted depictions of crime generally. Apparently, it reported that 92% of all traffic stops, for example, end in arrest, when in actuality it's about 2%. Incidentally, I just really do think that a lot of the show's success does depend on its amazing soundtrack. Bad Boys is such a great tune, and apparently the rights to that song were sold for $2,500 for this show that went on to make at least $500 million and the rest. Can you imagine?
I would actually say the secret of success is even more straightforward than that. It is the presence of weaponry. That is what makes an American fly-on-the-wall police documentary different to any other, isn't it? The police all have guns, and that means every single scene there's a possibility someone's about to get shot in front of you for something quite straightforward, like running away from a police officer, which in this country would be like, oh, well, we'll have to get him on CCTV. And there it's like, let's shoot him in the back now.
Well, I mean, you can actually see that in some of the one-off specials that they've done over the years. They've been to the UK, they've been to Hong Kong, and yeah, you do see that there's a big difference in the level of drama and danger. Actually, the first spin-off they did was at the end of the first series in 1989, where they followed Leningrad police in the then USSR. And at the time, Langley told the LA Times that not only was it easier to get permission to follow these police than it was in the US, he praised the Soviet cops. He said how polite they were extremely restrained.
And everyone signed the release forms. It's uncanny.
Next time.
He told this reporter, "I'm sorry I sold it back in 1964. It would have been smaller now, but a lot better."
Love the show? Support the show. Patreon.com/retrospectors. Part of the Acast Creator Network.